Texas, 1883. The sky hung heavy with stars over Deadwater Creek, a tiny settlement clinging to existence on the edge of civilization. Those same stars watched over Finley Fairchild as he rode alone through the night, the rhythm of his horse's hooves matching the beating of his solitary heart. At 25, Finley had already seen more death than most men twice his age, and it had carved something essential from him: the ability to believe in permanence. "Come on, Sable," he murmured to his midnight black mare, patting her neck as they crested the rise overlooking his small ranch. The modest cabin and barn appeared as dark silhouettes against the moonlit landscape. 3 years he'd been here, building something from nothing, but always alone. Always keeping his distance from the townsfolk in Deadwater. Frontier life had taught him early: attachments were dangerous. Everyone he'd ever loved had been taken. First his mother to fever, then his father and brother to Apache raiders. The lesson seemed clear as the stars above. The West was no place for tenderness. A man survived by keeping his heart as hard as the rocky soil and his emotions buried deeper than a prairie dog's den. Finley was lean but strong, his body honed by years of ranch work. Sandy brown hair fell across a face that, despite its youth, held a gravity in the blue eyes that had seen too much. The light stubble on his jaw caught the moonlight as he dismounted at his barn. "It's just you and me, girl," he told Sable as he unsaddled her. "And that's how we like it." But the words rang hollow in the empty barn. Truth was, loneliness had become a constant companion, as familiar as the Colt revolver at his hip. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, he wondered what it might be like to hear another voice in his cabin, to feel the warmth of a hand that wasn't his own. But those thoughts were dangerous, distractions that could get a man killed out here, where survival demanded constant vigilance. What Finley wanted, or thought he wanted, was simple: to build his small cattle operation, to survive another season, to keep the fragile peace with neighboring ranchers and the occasional bands of Comanche who passed through. He had no greater ambitions, no foolish dreams of love or family. What he could not yet see was what he truly needed, the very thing he feared most: connection. The spring cattle drive had been grueling. 2 weeks pushing 100 head to the railhead at Fort Worth had left Finley bone-weary. He'd hired 3 hands for the drive, but they'd gone their separate ways after collecting their pay. Now, riding back toward Deadwater Creek alone, Finley found himself looking forward to the solitude of his ranch with a mixture of relief and that nameless ache that sometimes gripped his chest when the nights grew too quiet. It was approaching dusk when he spotted the smoke. At first, just a smudge against the darkening sky, but unmistakable, coming from the direction of his property. Finley dug his heels into Sable's flanks, heart hammering. Raiders? Rustlers? Either way, it meant trouble. As he drew closer, his fears were confirmed. His cabin was intact, but smoke billowed from the barn, orange flames licking at the wooden structure. And then he heard it, a woman's scream piercing the evening air. Without hesitation, Finley leaped from his still-moving horse, drawing his revolver as he sprinted toward the barn. The doors stood partially open, smoke pouring out into the twilight. Inside, he could make out the silhouettes of his panicked horses and the figure of a young woman backed against the far wall, a pitchfork held tremblingly in her hands as she faced down a massive mountain lion that had her cornered. "Stay back," Finley shouted, aiming his Colt at the predator. The big cat whirled, snarling, its tawny coat illuminated by the growing flames along the barn's eastern wall. In one fluid motion, Finley fired, the bullet striking the ground near the mountain lion. The beast hesitated, then bounded past him and out into the night, choosing freedom over confrontation. The woman let out another scream as a burning beam crashed down nearby, igniting a stack of hay. "This way." Finley holstered his gun and rushed to her, taking her arm. She was young, perhaps 20, with honey-blonde hair escaping from a once neat bun, her blue calico dress smudged with soot and torn at the hem. Her eyes, wide with terror, were the color of summer wildflowers. She stumbled, and Finley swept her into his arms without thinking, carrying her through the smoke and out into the clean evening air. Setting her down a safe distance from the barn, he turned back. "My horses," he muttered, and dashed back toward the burning structure. 15 minutes later, with the horses safely corralled in the nearby pasture, Finley worked frantically with buckets from the well. The woman joined him, her delicate hands blistering as she helped pass water. Together, they managed to extinguish the worst of the flames before they could consume the entire structure, though half the barn was lost. When the immediate danger had passed, Finley turned to find the young woman swaying on her feet, exhaustion and shock evident in her pale face. "You're safe with me now," he said, the words emerging before he'd thought them through. He steadied her with a gentle hand. "I'm Finley Fairchild. This is my ranch." "Norah," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke and screaming. "Norah Zeller. I'm so sorry about your barn. I was just looking for shelter when that animal followed me in." Finley's natural suspicion warred with the undeniable vulnerability in her eyes. "What brings you out here alone, Miss Zeller? Deadwater Creek is a good 15 miles east." Norah's eyes darted to the darkness beyond the ranch, and Finley saw fear there, not of him, but of something or someone else. "I needed to get away," she said simply. "I've been walking since yesterday." The revelation struck Finley like a physical blow. A woman alone on foot in this territory was as good as dead. Mountain lions were only one of many dangers. "You'd best come inside," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Night's falling, and we both need tending to." As he led her toward his home, Finley felt the comfortable isolation of his existence fracture. This woman, this stranger, had stumbled into his carefully ordered world, bringing danger, complication, and an awakening he wasn't prepared for. Norah Zeller sat at Finley's rough-hewn table, her fingers wrapped around a tin mug of coffee, steam rising to caress her face. At 21, she possessed a beauty that seemed at odds with the harshness of frontier life. A delicate profile, full lips, and those striking violet-blue eyes that caught the lamplight. Her blonde hair, now freed from its ruined bun, cascaded past her shoulders. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door," she said softly. "I'll move on come morning." Finley, busying himself with bandaging a burn on his forearm, paused. "That would be foolish. There's nothing but open country for miles. Whatever you're running from." "Who says I'm running?" Her chin lifted defiantly. "Your feet tell that story plain enough." He nodded toward her worn boots, the leather cracked and stained with miles of dust. "And the fear in your eyes when you look eastward." Norah's shoulders sagged. "It's my stepfather. He arranged a marriage for me. To a man 3 times my age who's buried 2 wives already." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I couldn't. I just couldn't." Something stirred in Finley's chest, a protectiveness he thought he'd buried along with his family. "No one's forcing you into any marriage from my property," he heard himself say. "You can stay until you figure out your next move." Surprise registered on her face. "You do that? For a stranger?" Finley turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude and his own unexpected generosity. "Don't read too much into it. Can't in good conscience send a woman alone into Indian territory. Besides, you helped save half my barn." That night, Finley made a pallet for himself on the floor, giving Norah his narrow bed. As he lay awake, listening to her soft breathing, he felt the first cracks forming in the fortress he'd built around his heart. The presence of another person in his home, in his life, awakened memories he'd long suppressed. His mother's laughter, his father's strong hand on his shoulder, his brother's conspiratorial whispers. But with those sweet recollections came the darkness, the screams in the night, the arrows, the blood soaking into parched earth. Attachments meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant pain. That was the law of the frontier, as immutable as gravity. Finley closed his eyes, determined to maintain the distance he'd cultivated for so long. Norah Zeller was simply a temporary responsibility, nothing more. In a few days, she would move on, and his life would return to its solitary rhythm. Or so he told himself. The following week brought an unexpected rhythm to Finley's normally solitary existence. With half the barn destroyed, there was no shortage of work, and Norah proved herself surprisingly capable. Despite her fine-boned hands and city education, she'd attended school in San Antonio until she was 18. She approached ranch chores with determined energy. "You don't have to do that," Finley said one morning, finding her feeding his remaining livestock. "I won't be a burden," she replied simply. "You've given me shelter. The least I can do is earn my keep." Working side by side to rebuild the damaged barn wall, Finley found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. The graceful line of her neck, the quiet competence in her movements, the occasional smile that transformed her serious face into something that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. "Where did you learn to drive nails like that?" he asked as she expertly secured a board. "My father was a carpenter before the fever took him," she said without looking up. "I was his only child, so he taught me what he could." A shadow crossed her face. "My mother remarried when I was 16. Vernon, my stepfather, he has different ideas about a woman's place." Finley nodded, understanding more than she knew. "My father believed in teaching useful skills too. Set out here. You never know what might keep you alive." "Did it?" she asked softly. "Keep you alive?" The question struck deeper than she could have known. Finley turned back to his work, hammering with unnecessary force. "I'm still here, aren't I?" That evening, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson, Finley found himself talking more than he had in years. He told Norah about his small herd of cattle, his plans to expand, the challenges of ranching in territory still contested by Comanche and occasionally Mexican bandits. "You've built something real here," Norah said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Something that's yours alone." Alone being the operative word, Finley replied, instantly regretting the bitterness that crept into his tone. Norah studied him for a long moment. "You choose it that way, don't you? The solitude." "It's safer," he said simply. "Safer than what?" she pressed. Finley stood abruptly, unwilling to continue down this path. Then the alternative. He retreated into the cabin, leaving Norah alone with the dying light. That night, the nightmare returned, the one where he relived finding his family's bodies, arrows protruding from their chests, their eyes open and unseeing. He woke with a strangled cry, sweat-soaked and shaking. "Finley." Norah's voice came from the darkness, soft with concern. "Go back to sleep," he managed, his voice rough. Instead, he heard her bare feet on the wooden floor, and then she was kneeling beside him, a cool hand on his brow. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. The simple touch, the gentleness of her words, broke something loose inside him. Before he could stop himself, Finley was telling her everything. About the raid that had taken his family, how he'd been away hunting when it happened, how he'd spent years drifting from town to town before settling here, carrying the weight of survivor's guilt. "I should have been there," he concluded, his voice hollow. "Maybe I could have saved them, or died alongside them," Norah said gently. "And then who would have saved me from that mountain lion?" The observation, so simple and direct, pierced the armor of self-recrimination Finley had worn for years. He looked up at Norah, really seeing her in that moment, not as an intrusion or a temporary responsibility, but as a person whose path had crossed his for reasons he couldn't yet understand. "You should get some rest," he said finally, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. She nodded and returned to the bed, but something had shifted between them, a tentative bridge forming across the chasm of Finley's carefully maintained isolation. 3 weeks after Norah's arrival, riders appeared on the horizon. Finley spotted them from the newly repaired barn roof. 3 men on horseback, approaching from the east. From Deadwater Creek. "Norah," he called, climbing down quickly. "Someone's coming." The color drained from her face as she shaded her eyes against the morning sun. "It's him," she whispered. "Vernon. And he's brought the sheriff." Finley's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. "Go inside. You don't have to face him if you don't want to." "No." Norah straightened her spine, squaring her shoulders despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I won't hide." As the riders drew closer, Finley could make out the figures. A heavy-set man with a walrus mustache who had to be Vernon, Sheriff Hayes, whom Finley knew by sight from his infrequent trips to town, and a third man, older, with a prosperous look about him. Expensive clothes and a gold watch chain visible across his vest. "That's him," Norah said, her voice barely audible. "Edgar Wilmot. The man Vernon wants me to marry." The 3 men reined in their horses in the yard. Vernon dismounted first, his face flushed with anger beneath his bowler hat. "There you are, girl," he bellowed. "You've had the whole county in an uproar with your foolishness. Your mother's been beside herself with worry." Sheriff Hayes touched the brim of his hat. "Fairchild," he acknowledged. "Seems we've found our runaway." Finley positioned himself slightly in front of Norah. "Miss Zeller came to my property seeking refuge. She's been here of her own free will." "Refuge?" Vernon sputtered. "From what? A good home and a respectable marriage proposal?" Edgar here has been more than patient. He gestured to the older man, who regarded Norah with the calculating gaze of someone appraising livestock. I'm 21 years old, Norah said, her voice stronger than Finley expected. I'm not property to be traded or sold. You're an ungrateful child who doesn't know what's best for her, Vernon snapped. Edgar is willing to overlook this indiscretion and still take you as his wife. You should be thanking him on bended knee. Wilmot finally spoke, his voice cultured but cold. I've invested considerable funds in your stepfather's business ventures, Miss Zeller. Our arrangement is beneficial to all parties. All parties except me, Norah replied. I won't marry you, Mr. Wilmot. Not now, not ever. Vernon advanced toward her, hand raised. You'll do as you're told, girl. Finley drew his revolver in one smooth motion, not aiming it directly at Vernon, but making his meaning clear. That's far enough. Sheriff Hayes dismounted quickly, his own hand moving to his gun. Now hold on, Fairchild. You're interfering in a family matter here. Not when it happens on my land, Finley said evenly. Miss Zeller has made her wishes clear. She's not leaving with you against her will. Are you claiming some right to her? Wilmot asked, his eyes narrowing. Have you dishonored this young woman during her stay here? The accusation made Finley's blood boil, but Norah spoke before he could respond. Mr. Fairchild has been nothing but a gentleman, she said firmly. He's offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. And yes, I would rather stay here as his housekeeper than be forced into marriage with a man I don't love. Vernon laughed harshly. Housekeeper? Is that what they're calling it these days? That's enough, Sheriff Hayes intervened. Miss Zeller, you're of legal age. I can't force you to go with your stepfather. But Fairchild, you're walking a dangerous line here. The law's on my side, Finley replied. And I suggest you all leave my property now. For a tense moment, it seemed Vernon might push the issue, but Sheriff Hayes placed a restraining hand on his arm. We're leaving, but this isn't over, he warned. Vernon here has friends in high places. You might find ranching gets a lot harder when the bank calls in loans or the cattle buyers won't do business with you. Finley held his ground, and eventually, the three men mounted and rode away, but not before Vernon called back. This isn't over, Norah. You'll come to your senses soon enough when you see what frontier life really means. As the dust from their horses settled, Finley holstered his revolver. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Claim you were staying as my housekeeper. Norah's eyes met his, a new determination in them. It wasn't entirely a lie. I'd like to stay, Finley, if you'll have me. The request hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither was ready to name. Finley should say no. Every instinct built over years of solitude screamed at him to protect himself, to not let another person close enough to leave a wound when they inevitably departed or were taken. Instead, he heard himself say, I could use the help. And in that moment, the first true smile he'd seen from Norah Zeller transformed her face, and something long dormant in Finley Fairchild's heart stirred to life. Spring melted into summer, and Finley found his carefully ordered existence irrevocably changed. Norah brought life to corners of his cabin that had gathered dust for years. She planted a vegetable garden beside the house, hung curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, and filled the silent evenings with conversation. More disconcerting was how quickly he grew accustomed to her presence. The sound of her humming as she worked, the way sunlight caught in her hair, the gentle teasing that had begun to replace her initial reserve. You've lived here 3 years and never planted so much as a radish? She asked one evening as they sat down to a supper that included fresh greens from her garden. Never saw the point, Finley admitted. Beans and coffee kept me alive well enough. There's a difference between being alive and living, she replied, her gaze holding his for a beat longer than necessary. That difference was becoming clearer to Finley with each passing day. The ranch that had been merely shelter was transforming into a home. The work that had been solely about survival now held purpose beyond himself. One afternoon, returning from checking fence lines, Finley paused at the ridge overlooking his property. The sight below caught him off guard. Norah hanging laundry on the line, her honey blonde hair loose around her shoulders, moving with grace and purpose in the sunlight. Something tightened in his chest, a longing so acute it was almost painful. For the first time in years, Finley Fairchild could envision a future beyond mere existence. And it terrified him. That evening, As they sat on the porch watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the distant plains, lightning illuminating the massive cloud formations, Norah asked the question that had been building between them. Why have you never married, Finley? A man with land, ability. You must have had opportunities. Finley kept his eyes on the horizon. Never met anyone worth the risk. The risk of what? Losing them. The admission escaped before he could stop it. Everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me. After a while, you learn not to form attachments. Norah was quiet for so long that Finley thought the conversation had ended. Then her hand found his in the gathering darkness, her fingers intertwining with his own. What a lonely way to live, she said softly. Protecting yourself from loss by ensuring you have nothing to lose. The simple touch of her hand in his unraveled years of careful emotional distance. Without thinking, Finley turned to her, his free hand rising to brush a strand of hair from her face. The storm's approaching electricity seemed to crackle between them as his fingers traced the delicate line of her jaw. Norah, he began, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried for too long. She leaned toward him, eyes shining in the dim light. Yes. Before Finley could cross that final distance, a crack of lightning illuminated 3 riders approaching through the downpour that had just begun. He jerked back, immediately alert to the danger. Someone's coming, he said, rising to his feet and reaching for his rifle. Get inside. The moment shattered, Norah obeyed, but cast one last glance at him. A look that promised this conversation wasn't over. The riders turned out to be neighbors seeking shelter from the storm, the Dalton brothers from the next ranch over. As Finley welcomed them inside, he caught them appraising Norah with obvious interest and felt an unfamiliar surge of possessiveness. We didn't know you had a wife, Fairchild, the eldest Dalton said, removing his dripping hat. Before Finley could correct him, Norah stepped forward. I'm helping Mr. Fairchild with the ranch, she said simply, offering coffee to the rain-soaked men. Later, after the Daltons had departed with the passing of the storm, an awkward silence fell between Finley and Norah. They'll talk, Finley said finally. People will assume. Let them, Norah replied, her cheeks flushed. Unless you're concerned for your reputation. It's your reputation I'm thinking of. Norah's laugh held a bitter edge. My reputation was compromised the moment I fled my stepfather's house. Besides, I've learned that what others think matters far less than what I know to be true. She paused, meeting his gaze directly. And what I know is that I've never felt safer or more myself than I have these past months. With you. The admission hung between them, an invitation Finley wasn't ready to accept. Not yet. Not when every instinct honed by years of loss warned him that happiness was temporary, that to love was to invite devastation. It's late, he said, retreating behind the walls he'd built so carefully. We should get some rest. The disappointment in Norah's eyes as she nodded and turned away cut deeper than any physical wound Finley had ever suffered. July brought scorching heat and drought to Deadwater Creek. The creek itself dwindled to a trickle, and ranchers began the desperate calculations of how long their water supplies would last. Finley's well remained strong, but the pastures grew brown and withered, forcing him to move his small herd multiple times in search of adequate grazing. It was during one such cattle drive that disaster struck. Finley and Norah were herding the cattle toward a greener valley 10 miles north when the ground began to tremble beneath them. Stampede, Finley shouted, recognizing the danger instantly. But it wasn't their cattle. It was a much larger herd cresting the ridge to their east, hundreds of longhorns running blind with panic directly toward them. Norah, get to the high ground. Finley pointed toward a rocky outcropping as he spurred his horse to turn their own cattle away from the oncoming tide of horns and hooves. In the chaos that followed, Finley lost sight of Norah. Dust filled the air as the stampeding cattle thundered past, narrowly missing their small herd. When the dust finally settled, Finley's blood ran cold as he spotted Norah's horse standing riderless near the outcropping. Norah! His cry echoed across the suddenly silent landscape as he galloped toward the last place he'd seen her. Norah! He found her crumpled at the base of the rocks, her dress torn and bloodied, her face pale beneath a layer of dust. For one horrifying moment, Finley thought he was reliving his worst nightmare, finding someone he cared for beyond saving. Then Norah's eyelids fluttered. Finley, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Relief flooded him with such force that his hands shook as he carefully examined her for broken bones. Her left arm was clearly fractured, and a gash on her forehead bled freely, but she was alive. "Don't move," he instructed, his voice tight with fear and something deeper. "I'm going to get you home." With infinite care, Finley fashioned a splint for her arm, using his neckerchief and 2 straight sticks. Then he lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her and cradling her against his chest for the long ride home. "I'm sorry," Norah murmured as they rode, drifting in and out of consciousness. "I should have been faster." "Hush now," Finley said, his lips close to her ear. "Just stay with me. Stay with me, Norah." The journey back to the ranch was the longest of Finley's life. Each moan from Norah as the horse navigated the uneven terrain was a knife to his heart. By the time they reached the cabin, her dress was soaked through with blood from the head wound, and Finley's own shirt was stained crimson. Working quickly, he carried her inside and laid her on his bed. With trembling hands, he cleaned the gash on her forehead, stitching it closed with the steady precision his father had taught him for mending torn flesh, a necessary skill on the frontier where doctors were scarce. He set her arm as best he could, splinting it more permanently, then bathed her face with cool water from the well. Throughout the night, Finley sat beside her, changing the cool cloths on her forehead when fever set in, speaking to her in low, urgent tones when she grew restless. And in those dark hours, as he watched the rise and fall of her chest and counted each breath as a blessing, Finley confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He loved her. Despite every wall he'd built, every lesson the frontier had taught him about the danger of attachment, Norah Zeller had slipped past his defenses and claimed a place in his heart. Dawn was breaking when Norah finally opened her eyes fully, awareness returning to her gaze. "You stayed," she whispered, her good hand finding his. "Of course I stayed," Finley replied, his voice rough from the long night's vigil. "I saw them coming, the cattle. I tried to reach the rocks, but my horse reared." She winced as pain registered from her injuries. "Don't think about that now," Finley said, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "You're going to be fine." Norah's eyes searched his face. "You were afraid," she said, not a question but a realization. "Afraid you'd lose me." The simple truth of her words stripped away Finley's last defenses. "Yes," he admitted, his voice breaking. I thought I'd found you too late. Like my family. But you didn't," she said softly. "You found me in time. You saved me. I can't lose you." "Norah," Finley said, the words rushing out as if a dam had broken. "I've spent years believing that caring for someone meant inevitable pain. That loving was a weakness I couldn't afford out here. But I was wrong. So wrong." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her palm. "These months with you, you've brought life back to this place. To me." Tears filled Norah's eyes. "I've loved you since that first night when you carried me from the burning barn," she confessed. "But I was afraid you'd send me away if you knew." "Never," Finley vowed. "I want you here. With me. Always." In that moment, as sunlight streamed through the cabin window illuminating Norah's face, bruised but beautiful, vulnerable but strong, Finley Fairchild felt the last of his walls crumble. The frontier had taught him that love was dangerous, that attachment meant inevitable loss. But Norah had shown him a deeper truth, that a life without love was no life at all. Leaning forward, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after years in the wilderness. Autumn painted the landscape in golds and crimsons as Finley's small ranch transformed. With Norah's arm healed and her strength returned, they worked side by side to prepare for winter. The garden yielded a bounty that Norah preserved in jars lining the cabin shelves. The repaired barn housed not only Finley's horses, but now a milk cow and a flock of chickens. Norah's additions that had initially made Finley raise his eyebrows, but that he now recognized as the foundations of a true homestead. But the most profound change was within Finley himself. The man who had once believed that isolation was his only protection now found strength in partnership, joy in shared labor, and peace in the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The sound of approaching horses drew them both to the porch one crisp October afternoon. Finley tensed when he recognized Vernon Zeller among the 4 riders approaching, with Edgar Wilmot and 2 rough-looking men he didn't know. "Stay inside," Finley told Norah, reaching for his rifle. "No," she said firmly, standing beside him. We face this together. Vernon reined his horse to a stop in the yard, his face flushed with anger and drink. Time's up, girl, he called. You've played house with this cowboy long enough. Edgar's patience has run out, and so has mine. Wilmot looked even more prosperous than before, but his expression had hardened into something ugly. Your stepfather owes me a considerable sum, Miss Zeller. A debt that was to be satisfied by our marriage. Since you've chosen to renege on that arrangement, I've been forced to call in the loan. His business is ruined. That's hardly my concern, Norah replied steadily. I never agreed to be collateral for his debts. You ungrateful, Vernon began, but Wilmot raised a hand to silence him. I've purchased the note on this property from the bank in Deadwater Creek, Wilmot announced with cold satisfaction. As of yesterday, Fairchild, you have 30 days to repay the full amount or this land belongs to me. Finley felt as if he'd been kicked in the chest. That's impossible. The loan isn't due for 2 more years. Banks can call in loans at their discretion during times of financial instability, Wilmot replied with a thin smile. And the president of the Deadwater Creek Bank is my cousin. You can't do this, Norah protested. I already have. However, Wilmot continued, his gaze lingering on Norah. I'm prepared to be generous. If you agree to the marriage we arranged, I'll forgive Fairchild's debt and allow him to remain as a tenant on what was once his land. A fair exchange, I think. Finley raised his rifle. Get off my property. Now. The 2 unknown men immediately drew their pistols, and Finley recognized them for what they were, hired guns. I wouldn't, one warned, his weapon aimed at Finley's chest. Mr. Wilmot doesn't take kindly to threats. I'm giving you one chance, Fairchild, Wilmot said. Convince her to honor her obligation, or lose everything you've built here. Before Finley could respond, Norah stepped forward. I'll make you a counteroffer, Mr. Wilmot. Leave us in peace, or I'll write to the territorial governor, who happens to be a friend of my late father, about how you're using your banking connections to defraud honest ranchers. I wonder how many other loans you've manipulated this way. The confidence in her voice made Finley glance at her in surprise. Wilmot's face darkened. You're bluffing. You have no such connection. Norah smiled, a dangerous expression Finley had never seen on her gentle face. My father was Jonathan Zeller, who saved Governor Thornton's life during the border conflicts of '68. The governor is my godfather. Would you care to test whether he'd take an interest in your business practices? The revelation hung in the air like gun smoke. Finley watched as uncertainty crossed Wilmot's face for the first time. She's lying, Vernon insisted. Jonathan never mentioned any such connection. Because he knew what kind of man you were, Norah replied coldly. He made me promise to keep it secret unless I faced dire need. I'd say this qualifies. Wilmot studied her for a long moment before turning to Vernon. Is this possible? Vernon's bluster faltered. I never questioned much about Jonathan's past before the war. The hired guns exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. One letter, Mr. Wilmot, Norah continued. One letter describing how you attempted to force me into marriage to settle a debt, then conspired to steal a man's property when I refused. How do you think that would look printed in the territorial newspaper? How would your banking associates in St. Louis respond? Finley watched in amazement as the color drained from Wilmot's face. This was a side of Norah he'd never seen. Steel beneath the gentleness. Unflinching courage born of principle. You'll regret this defiance, Wilmot said finally, but the threat sounded hollow. Both of you. He wheeled his horse around. Come, Vernon. There's nothing for us here. But the debt, Vernon protested, will be handled another way. Wilmot snapped, already riding away. The hired guns holstered their weapons and followed, with Vernon trailing reluctantly behind, casting one last venomous glance at his stepdaughter. When they had disappeared from sight, Finley turned to Norah in astonishment. Your godfather is the territorial governor? A mischievous smile played at her lips. My father did save a man named Thornton once, but he was a shopkeeper in San Antonio, not the governor. She laughed at Finley's expression. I gambled that neither Wilmot nor Vernon knew enough about my father's history to question it. Relief and admiration washed over Finley. He set down his rifle and gathered her in his arms, marveling at the woman who had turned his world upside down. You're full of surprises, Norah Zeller, he murmured against her hair. I'll fight for what matters to me. she replied simply, raising her face to his. And you matter, Finley Fairchild. This home we're building together matters. Home, he repeated, the word carrying a weight and warmth he'd almost forgotten. Yes, that's what this is now. That evening, as they sat before the fire, the first chill of autumn pressing against the cabin walls, Finley took Norah's hand in his. I don't know if Wilmot will stay away for good, he said seriously. Men like him don't give up easily. Then we'll face him together, Norah replied. Whatever comes. Finley nodded, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band, his mother's wedding ring, the one possession he'd carried with him through all his years of wandering. I've been carrying this since the day I found my family, he said quietly. I couldn't bear to part with it, but I never thought I'd have cause to use it. Until now. He met Norah's widening eyes. I love you, Norah. Will you marry me? Make this place truly our home. Tears spilled onto Norah's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Finley. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. Finley felt the last shadow of his old belief lift away. The frontier wasn't a place where love came to die. It was where love was most essential, most precious, most needed to transform mere survival into true living. December 1883. Snow dusted the grounds of the small church in Deadwater Creek as townsfolk gathered for a wedding few had anticipated. Inside, Norah stood radiant in a dress of ivory satin, ordered from a catalog in St. Louis and arrived just in time. Her honey-blonde hair adorned with winter berries and evergreen. Finley waited at the altar, barely recognizing himself in the new suit and polished boots. At 25, he stood taller somehow. The weight of solitude lifted from his shoulders, his blue eyes clear and focused on the future rather than the past. Sheriff Hayes, who had come to respect the couple after witnessing their stand against Wilmot, served as witness alongside Martha Dalton from the neighboring ranch, who had become Norah's friend in recent months. The territorial governor was not in attendance, of course, but his absence didn't matter. What mattered was the truth Finley spoke as he took Norah's hands in his. I once believed that the frontier was no place for love, he said, his voice steady and sure. That to survive here meant closing yourself off from everything that made you vulnerable. But you showed me that real strength comes from opening your heart, not locking it away. You are my home, Norah, my family, my future. Norah's violet blue eyes shimmered with tears as she responded. When I ran away, I was only running from something I feared. I never imagined I was running toward everything I ever wanted. You saw me at my most desperate moment and said, "You're safe with me now." And I have been, every day since. Safe to be myself. Safe to dream. Safe to love. As they exchanged vows and rings, a sense of rightness settled over Finley that he had never experienced before. This was what his parents had built before tragedy struck, not just a homestead, but a shared life, a partnership against the harshness of the frontier. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Finley kissed Norah with a promise that transcended words. The small congregation erupted in cheers and well wishes, the community that had once seemed so distant now embracing them both. Outside, snow began falling more heavily as they emerged from the church. Finley helped Norah into the wagon he'd decorated with pine boughs and ribbons for the occasion. "Are you ready, Mrs. Fairchild?" he asked, taking up the reins. Norah's smile outshone the winter sun glinting off the snow. "I've been ready since the moment you carried me from that burning barn." As they drove away toward their ranch, their home, Finley felt a certainty that had eluded him for most of his life. The path ahead would not be easy. The frontier would still demand its toll in hardship and challenge. Wilmot might yet cause trouble, and drought or blizzard could threaten their livestock. But for the first time, Finley understood that facing these trials together wasn't a weakness but the greatest strength he'd ever known. The young man who had once believed that love was a liability on the frontier now recognized it as the only thing that made frontier life worth living. That night, as snow blanketed their land in pristine white, Finley and Norah Fairchild stood on the porch of their cabin, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, watching the moon rise over what was now truly their home. The barn he had rebuilt with her help stood strong against the winter wind. Inside the cabin, the curtains she had sewn framed windows glowing with golden light. On the table waited the meal they had prepared together. "I used to dread winter," Finley admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. The isolation of it. The silence. And now? Norah asked, turning in his arms to face him. Now I welcome it, he said simply. Time alone with you. Time to plan our future. Come spring, we'll expand the herd, add to the garden. Perhaps build a larger cabin eventually. For when our family grows, Norah suggested, a hint of mischief in her smile. Finley's heart expanded at the thought. Children running across the land he'd once roamed in solitude, laughter filling the spaces where silence had reigned for too long. For when our family grows, he agreed, drawing her closer. For all the dreams we'll build together. As they turned to go inside, away from the cold and into the warmth of their shared beginning, Finley Fairchild understood at last what his father had tried to teach him all those years ago. The frontier wasn't just about survival. It was about creating something meaningful that would outlast you. A home, a family, a legacy of love that could withstand even the harshest elements. With Norah's hand in his, he stepped across the threshold into the future they would forge together, two hearts united against the wilderness, transforming it one day at a time into a place where love didn't just survive, it thrived.